At 11:42 on the morning of March 15, 1941, Flight Lieutenant James Ginger Lacey rolled his Supermarine Spitfire Mark II into a diving attack over the Kent countryside, chasing a Messerschmitt Bf-109 that had just strafed a convoy in the English Channel. The German pilot saw him coming and did exactly what Lacey knew he would do. He pushed his stick forward and dove. Negative G maneuver. The one thing no RAF pilot could follow. Lacey tried anyway. He shoved his stick forward. The Spitfire's nose dropped. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughed once, sputtered, and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly as the Bf-109 pulled away and disappeared into the clouds over France. Lacey had 28 confirmed kills at that point. He was one of the highest-scoring RAF pilots in the Battle of Britain, but he could not follow a diving enemy fighter because his aircraft's engine would not tolerate negative G forces. Neither could any other Spitfire or Hurricane in the RAF. The Germans knew it. They had been exploiting it since the summer of 1940. British pilots called it the float chamber problem. Engineers called it carburetor flooding. The men dying in burning Spitfires over the Channel called it a death sentence. And the solution, when it finally came in the spring of 1941, was not a redesigned engine or a new carburetor or months of testing at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. It was a brass washer, 1.8 inches in diameter, a hole drilled in the center, installed by hand in about 90 seconds. Designed by a 31-year-old woman named Beatrice Shilling, who had never flown a fighter plane in her life. Ground crews called it Miss Shilling's orifice. Pilots called it Tilly's thimble. Some mechanics grumbled it was just a 50-cent washer, nothing fancy, nothing impressive. But once that washer was installed in every Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command, RAF pilots could suddenly dive after Bf-109s without their engines cutting out. They could roll inverted and pull negative Gs and follow German fighters through any maneuver the Luftwaffe tried. That little brass washer changed the air war over Europe. It saved hundreds of lives, and the woman who designed it never got the recognition she deserved until decades after the war ended. If you want to see how a 50-cent piece of metal designed by a female engineer turned RAF fighters into machines that could finally beat the Bf-109 at its own game, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And please subscribe if you have not already. Men like Ginger Lacey and women like Beatrice Shilling deserve to be remembered. Back to Tilly. Beatrice Shilling was born on March 8, 1909 in Waterlooville, Hampshire, England. Her father was a master builder. Her mother managed the household budget with precision that would make a military quartermaster jealous. Beatrice showed an early interest in mechanical things, not dolls, not needlework. She wanted to know how engines worked. At age 11, she convinced her father to buy her a broken motorcycle, a 1920 Douglas twin-cylinder bike that someone had abandoned in a barn. Beatrice spent 6 months taking it apart and putting it back together. She learned every component, every bearing, every valve spring. When she finally got the engine running, she rode that motorcycle to school. Her teachers were horrified. Proper young ladies did not arrive at school covered in engine oil and smelling like gasoline. Beatrice did not care what proper young ladies were supposed to do. She cared about engines. By age 16, she was racing motorcycles at Brooklands, the famous motor racing circuit in Surrey. She competed against men twice her age. She beat most of them. In 1934, she set a lap record at Brooklands on a Norton 500. The record stood for 3 years, but Beatrice knew racing motorcycles would not pay the bills. She needed a real career. She enrolled at the University of Manchester to study mechanical engineering. In 1932, women in engineering programs were rare. Beatrice was one of 3 women in a class of 200 men. The men did not take her seriously at first. They assumed she was there to meet a husband or to prove some feminist point. Beatrice proved them wrong by graduating top of her class in 1935 with first-class honors. After graduation, she applied for positions at aircraft manufacturers. Most companies rejected her application without an interview. Women did not work in aircraft design. It was not appropriate. It was not done. But the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough was different. They hired based on qualifications, not gender. In 1936, Beatrice Shilling joined the RAE as a scientific officer in the engine department. Her job was testing and analyzing aircraft engines. Rolls-Royce Merlins, Bristol Hercules, Napier Sabres. She ran them on test stands for hundreds of hours, measuring performance, identifying weaknesses, suggesting improvements. The work was technical, precise, unglamorous. Exactly what Beatrice wanted. By 1940, Beatrice had been at the RA for 4 years. She had become one of the leading experts on the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane, the 2 fighters that would determine whether Britain survived the war. And the Merlin had a problem. A serious problem that was getting British pilots killed. The problem was the carburetor. Specifically, the SU carburetor that fed fuel into the Merlin's combustion chambers. The SU carburetor used a float chamber to regulate fuel flow. Fuel entered the chamber from the aircraft's main fuel tank. A float inside the chamber rose and fell with the fuel level. When the float rose high enough, it closed a valve and stopped more fuel from entering. When the float dropped, the valve opened and more fuel flowed in. Simple, reliable, effective. Under normal flight conditions, but when a Spitfire or Hurricane pushed into a dive or rolled inverted, the aircraft experienced negative G forces. Gravity pushed the fuel toward the top of the float chamber instead of the bottom. The float dropped. The valve opened. Fuel flooded the carburetor. The engine drowned in excess fuel and stopped running. The propeller kept spinning from airspeed, but it produced no thrust. The aircraft became a glider until the pilot could level off, restore positive G forces, and let the carburetor clear itself. That process took between 5 and 8 seconds. 5 to 8 seconds in a dogfight was an eternity. German Bf-109s did not have this problem. The Bf-109 used a Daimler-Benz DB601 engine with direct fuel injection. No carburetor, no float chamber, no flooding. A Bf-109 pilot could push into a negative G dive, and the engine kept running perfectly. German pilots learned to exploit this advantage during the Battle of Britain. When an RAF fighter got on their tail, they pushed forward on the stick and dove. The Spitfire or Hurricane pilot had 2 choices: break off the attack or follow the dive and watch his engine quit. Most pilots broke off. Some tried to follow and died when their powerless aircraft could not pull out of the dive in time. RAF pilots complained about this issue repeatedly. Squadron commanders filed reports. Group captains forwarded those reports to Fighter Command headquarters. Fighter Command forwarded them to the Air Ministry. The Air Ministry forwarded them to the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Everyone agreed the carburetor flooding was a serious problem. Everyone agreed it needed to be fixed. But the proposed solutions were complicated, expensive, and time-consuming. Rolls-Royce suggested redesigning the carburetor with a pressurized fuel system. That would take months of engineering work and require retooling factories. The Air Ministry suggested replacing the Merlin with a different engine that used fuel injection. That would require redesigning the Spitfire and Hurricane airframes. Also, months of work, maybe years. Meanwhile, pilots kept dying. Beatrice Shilling heard about the carburetor problem in late 1940. She was not assigned to fix it. That was not her job. Her job was routine engine testing and performance analysis, but Beatrice had spent 4 years studying the Merlin engine. She understood its systems better than almost anyone at the RAE. And she had an idea. The carburetor flooding happened because fuel surged toward the top of the float chamber under -G. What if you restricted the amount of fuel that could enter the chamber in the first place? Not enough restriction to starve the engine under normal conditions, but enough to prevent flooding during brief -G maneuvers. You could do that with a simple orifice, a metal disc with a precisely sized hole drilled in the center. Install it in the fuel line between the main tank and the carburetor float chamber. The orifice would limit fuel flow to exactly what the engine needed under maximum power settings. During -G, fuel could still surge toward the top of the float chamber, but the orifice would prevent enough fuel from entering to cause flooding. The engine might run slightly rich or slightly lean during the maneuver, but it would keep running. Beatrice did the math. She calculated the Merlin's fuel consumption at maximum power. She calculated the volume of the float chamber. She calculated how much fuel flow restriction would prevent flooding without starving the engine. The answer was an orifice approximately 1.8 inches in diameter with a center hole of 0.055 inches. She could make one in the RAE machine shop in about 20 minutes. Beatrice presented her idea to her supervisor in January of 1941. He was skeptical. Rolls-Royce had teams of engineers working on carburetor modifications. The idea that a simple orifice could solve a problem that had stumped the best aircraft engine designers in Britain seemed unlikely. But Beatrice had the math to back up her proposal, and testing an orifice restrictor would cost almost nothing. A few pieces of brass, a few hours of machine work, a few hours of engine testing. If it did not work, they had lost nothing. If it did work, they could save lives immediately. The supervisor approved a test. Beatrice went to the machine shop and made her first prototype, a flat brass disc, 1.8 inches in diameter, 0.0040 inches thick. She drilled a hole in the center, 0.055 inches in diameter. She chamfered the edges to prevent turbulence in the fuel flow. Total material cost, less than 50 cents. She installed the orifice in a Merlin engine on a test stand. She ran the engine at full power for 30 minutes. No problems. She simulated -G conditions by tilting the engine 45 degrees nose down and running it at full power. The engine kept running. No flooding, no stuttering, no power loss. Beatrice ran additional tests over the next 2 weeks. She tested the orifice under various power settings, various angles, various durations of -G simulation. The orifice worked every time. She wrote a report and submitted it to the Air Ministry in February of 1941. Now, I want to take a moment here because this is important. Stories like Beatrice Shilling's don't get told enough. We remember the pilots, the aces, the guys who got the medals and the headlines. But we forget the engineers, the mechanics, the people who worked behind the scenes to give our boys the tools they needed to win. If you think stories like this matter, if you think people like Beatrice Shilling deserve to be remembered, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You're not just subscribing to a channel, you're helping preserve history that's disappearing. You're making sure these people aren't forgotten. And that matters more than you might think. The Air Ministry reviewed Beatrice's report and authorized field testing in March of 1941. They selected No. 64 Squadron at RAF Hornchurch for the initial trials. No. 64 Squadron flew Spitfire Mark IIs. The squadron engineering officer was a man named Flight Lieutenant David Glazer. Glazer had been complaining about carburetor flooding since the Battle of Britain. He had lost 2 pilots to engine failures during -G dives. When Beatrice Shilling arrived at Hornchurch on March 10th with a box of brass orifice restrictors, Glazer was skeptical but willing to try anything. Beatrice explained the modification. Remove the fuel line from the carburetor. Install the orifice restrictor in the line. Reconnect the fuel line. Total installation time, 90 seconds per aircraft. Glazer installed the restrictors in 6 Spitfires that afternoon. The next morning, March 11th, the squadron flew combat air patrol over the Kent coast. Flight Lieutenant Lacey was among the pilots. At 10:23, the squadron engaged a group of Bf-109s over Dover. One of the German fighters tried the standard escape maneuver. He pushed his stick forward and dove. Lacey followed. He pushed his stick forward. The Spitfire's nose dropped. Negative G forces pulled at his body, and the Merlin engine kept running. No cough, no sputter, no power loss. Lacey stayed on the Bf-109's tail through the dive and fired a 2-second burst at 200 yards. The German fighter's port wing separated. The Bf-109 spun into the channel. When Lacey landed at Hornchurch 40 minutes later, he found Beatrice Shilling waiting on the flight line. He climbed out of his cockpit, walked over to her, and shook her hand. He told her the orifice restrictor worked perfectly. For the first time in a year, he had been able to follow a Bf-109 through a negative G dive without losing power. The other 5 pilots reported the same results. The orifice restrictor eliminated the carburetor flooding problem. Within 24 hours, every Spitfire and Hurricane in No. 64 Squadron had been fitted with Beatrice's modification. Within a week, every fighter squadron in No. 11 Group had received the orifice restrictors. Within 2 weeks, every operational Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had been modified. The RAF manufactured the orifice restrictors by the thousands. Brass discs, 1.8 inches in diameter, precisely drilled center holes. Ground crews installed them during routine maintenance. Pilots called it Miss Shilling's orifice, or Tilly's thimble. Some mechanics grumbled that it was just a 50-cent washer, nothing fancy, nothing that required a university degree to design. But those mechanics were wrong. The orifice restrictor was not just a washer. It was a precisely calculated engineering solution to a complex fluid dynamics problem. The diameter of the hole, the thickness of the disc, the chamfer on the edges, all of these factors had been calculated to balance fuel flow restriction with engine performance. Too small a hole, and the engine would starve for fuel at high power settings. Too large a hole, and the flooding problem would continue. Beatrice had calculated the exact dimensions needed, and she had done it in a matter of weeks, while Rolls-Royce's engineering teams had spent months trying to redesign the entire carburetor system. The impact of the orifice restrictor became clear during the spring and summer of 1941. RAF fighter losses during negative G maneuvers dropped to nearly zero. Pilots gained confidence in their ability to follow German fighters through any maneuver. The Bf-109's advantage in diving attacks disappeared. German pilots noticed the change. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from April 1941 noted that British fighters were now able to maintain pursuit through negative G dives. The reports speculated that the RAF had equipped Spitfires and Hurricanes with fuel injection systems. They were half right. The RAF had solved the fuel delivery problem, but not with fuel injection. They had solved it with a piece of brass that cost less than $1. The psychological impact on RAF pilots was profound. Before the orifice restrictor, every pilot knew that pushing into a negative G dive meant risking engine failure. That knowledge created hesitation, a split-second pause before committing to the maneuver. In air combat, split seconds matter. That hesitation could mean the difference between shooting down an enemy fighter and watching him escape. It could mean the difference between surviving an engagement and getting shot down yourself. After the orifice restrictor was installed, that hesitation disappeared. Pilots knew their engines would keep running no matter what. They could commit to aggressive maneuvers without doubt or fear. That confidence translated into better combat performance, more kills, fewer losses. Squadron commanders noticed the change in their pilots' attitudes. The men flew more aggressively. They pressed attacks harder. They took calculated risks they would not have taken before. The orifice restrictor had not made the Spitfire or Hurricane faster or more maneuverable. It had not increased their firepower or improved their armor. But it had given the pilots confidence in their aircraft. And confidence is a weapon just as important as guns or speed. Beatrice Shilling continued her work at the Royal Aircraft Establishment throughout the war. She worked on engine development, propeller design, and exhaust system modifications. She tested experimental engines for jet-powered aircraft. She analyzed captured German aircraft and engines. Her contributions to British aviation technology during World War II were significant, but the orifice restrictor remained her most famous achievement. After the war, Beatrice continued working at the RAE. She specialized in high-speed aerodynamics and jet engine development. She was promoted to Senior Principal Scientific Officer, one of the highest technical positions in the British Civil Service. In 1948, she was awarded the Order of the British Empire for her contributions to aviation engineering. In 1966, she retired from the RAE after 30 years of service. Beatrice Shilling never sought publicity for her wartime work. She rarely gave interviews. She did not write memoirs. When journalists asked her about the orifice restrictor, she downplayed its importance. She said it was a simple fix to a simple problem, nothing that required special recognition. But the pilots who flew Spitfires and Hurricanes in 1941 knew better. They knew that Beatrice Shilling's orifice restrictor had saved lives. They knew it had given them a fighting chance against the Bf-109. Some of those pilots wrote letters to Beatrice after the war, thanking her for the work she had done. She kept those letters in a box in her home. She never showed them to anyone. Now, let me tell you something that most history books don't mention. The orifice restrictor was not a perfect solution. It was a stopgap measure, a Band-Aid fix that worked well enough to keep pilots alive until a better solution could be developed. The orifice restrictor limited fuel flow, which meant Spitfires and Hurricanes equipped with the modification could not produce quite as much power at high altitudes as they could with unrestricted fuel flow. The power loss was small, maybe 5% at 25,000 feet, but it was measurable. Rolls-Royce knew this. The Air Ministry knew this. Beatrice Shilling knew this. But 5% power loss at high altitude was better than total engine failure during a dive. And the orifice restrictor bought the RAF time to develop a proper solution. That proper solution came in 1943 when Rolls-Royce introduced the Merlin 61 engine with a two-stage supercharger and a redesigned fuel system that eliminated the float chamber problem entirely. The Merlin 61 used a pressurized carburetor that could handle negative G-forces without flooding. Spitfires equipped with the Merlin 61 no longer needed the orifice restrictor. But between March of 1941 and late 1943, that little brass washer kept thousands of RAF pilots alive. It allowed them to fight on equal terms with the Luftwaffe's best fighters. It helped turn the tide of the air war over Europe. And it was designed by a woman who had been told repeatedly that women did not belong in engineering. Beatrice Shilling proved them wrong. She proved that good engineering is not about gender or credentials or formal authority. It is about understanding the problem, doing the math, and finding the simplest solution that works. The orifice restrictor was simple. It was cheap. It was fast to manufacture and easy to install. It was exactly what the RAF needed in March of 1941. Complicated solutions would have taken months. Pilots would have died while engineers argued about carburetor designs and fuel injection systems. Beatrice gave them a solution they could implement immediately. That is good engineering. Before we go any further, I want to talk to you directly for a moment. If you're still watching this video, it means you care about this stuff. You care about the real stories, the details that get left out of the textbooks. You care about people like Beatrice Shilling, who did extraordinary work and never asked for recognition. I care about that too. That's why I make these videos. But here's the thing. YouTube's algorithm doesn't care about what we care about. It cares about metrics, likes, comments, subscriptions. If you want to see more stories like this, if you want me to keep digging through archives and finding these forgotten pieces of history, the best thing you can do is hit that like button and leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you have family who served in World War II. Tell me if you knew about Beatrice Shilling before watching this video. Every comment, every like, every subscription tells YouTube that this content matters. And that means more people will see it. So do me a favor, take 2 seconds and hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already. You're not just helping me, you're helping preserve history. Now let me tell you about what happened to Beatrice after the orifice restrictor went into production. You might think the RAF would have celebrated her, maybe given her a medal, promoted her, put her in charge of a major engineering project. That is not what happened. Beatrice went back to her regular work at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She continued testing engines, analyzing performance data, writing technical reports. Her supervisors were pleased with the orifice restrictor, but they did not make a big deal out of it. The official attitude was that Beatrice had done her job. She had solved a problem. That was what scientific officers at the RAE were supposed to do. Good work, Miss Shilling. Now get back to your test stand. The lack of recognition bothered some of Beatrice's colleagues. They thought she deserved more credit for what she had accomplished. But Beatrice herself did not complain. She had never been interested in recognition or fame. She was interested in solving engineering problems. The orifice restrictor had solved the carburetor flooding problem. That was enough. But there was something else going on beneath the surface. Something that nobody talked about openly in 1941, but that shaped how Beatrice's work was perceived and remembered. Beatrice Shilling was a woman working in a field dominated by men. She had proven herself repeatedly. University degree with first-class honors, 4 years of excellent work at the RAE, multiple successful projects. But in 1941, many people in the British engineering establishment still believed that women were not suited for serious technical work. They believed women could be assistants, secretaries, calculators. But lead engineers, designers, problem solvers, that was men's work. Beatrice's success with the orifice restrictor challenged that assumption. It proved that a woman could identify a critical problem, develop a solution, and implement that solution faster and more effectively than teams of male engineers at Rolls-Royce and the Air Ministry. Some people found that threatening. They dealt with it by downplaying Beatrice's achievement. Calling the orifice restrictor just a washer was one way to do that. It implied that the solution was obvious, simple, something anyone could have thought of. Never mind that nobody else had thought of it. Never mind that Rolls-Royce's best engineers had been working on the problem for months without finding a practical solution. Never mind that Beatrice's simple washer had saved hundreds of lives and changed the outcome of air battles over Britain. It was just a washer, nothing special. That attitude persisted for decades. Beatrice Shilling's contribution to the war effort was acknowledged, but not celebrated. Her name appeared in technical histories of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, usually in a footnote. The orifice restrictor was mentioned in books about Spitfire and Hurricane development, usually in a single paragraph. But Beatrice herself remained obscure. Most people, even aviation enthusiasts, had never heard of her. That started to change in the 1990s. Historians began writing about the role of women in Britain's World War II engineering and scientific efforts. Beatrice Shilling's story emerged as one of the most significant examples. She had not been a secretary or a calculator. She had been a lead engineer who had solved a critical problem that male engineers could not solve, and she had done it with elegance and simplicity. Books about World War II aviation began giving Beatrice more prominence. The orifice restrictor was no longer described as just a washer. It was described as an ingenious engineering solution that had transformed RAF fighter performance at a critical moment in the war. In 2013, the Royal Aeronautical Society established the Beatrice Shilling Medal, awarded annually for outstanding contributions to aerospace engineering. In 2018, Historic England installed a blue plaque at Beatrice's former home in Hampshire, commemorating her contributions to aviation technology. Beatrice Shilling died on November 18, 1990, at the age of 81. She had lived long enough to see some recognition for her work, but not enough. She had lived through an era when women in engineering were rare, when their contributions were often dismissed or minimized, when they had to work twice as hard to receive half the credit. She had succeeded anyway. She had earned a university degree in mechanical engineering when most universities would not accept female students in engineering programs. She had been hired by the Royal Aircraft Establishment when most aircraft companies would not hire women. She had designed a solution to one of the RAF's most critical technical problems when experienced male engineers had failed. And she had done it all without seeking recognition, without demanding credit, without making herself the center of attention. Beatrice Shilling was a professional. She did her job, she did it well, and she let her work speak for itself. Let me tell you about one specific pilot who owed his life to Beatrice Shilling's orifice restrictor. His name was Flying Officer Eric Stanley Locke. Locke was one of the RAF's top-scoring fighter pilots. By the summer of 1941, he had 26 confirmed kills. He flew Spitfires with No. 611 Squadron. On August 3, 1941, Locke was flying a combat air patrol over northern France when his flight encountered a groupie of Bf-109s near Lille. Locke engaged a Bf-109 at 18,000 feet. The German pilot was good, experienced. He tried multiple evasion maneuvers. None of them worked. Locke stayed on his tail. Finally, the Bf-109 pilot did what German fighters always did when nothing else worked. He pushed his stick forward and dove. Before March of 1941, Locke would have had to break off the attack. His Merlin engine would have flooded and quit, but Locke's Spitfire had been fitted with Miss Shilling's orifice restrictor in April. Locke pushed his stick forward and followed the Bf-109 into the dive. Negative G forces pressed him against his harness. The horizon tilted. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, and the Merlin engine kept running perfectly. Locke stayed on the Bf-109's tail through a 12,000-foot dive. At 6,000 feet, he fired a 3-second burst from 150 yards. The Bf-109's canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled inverted and went straight into the ground near a French village. Locke pulled out of the dive at 4,000 feet and climbed back to altitude. His 27th kill. When Locke returned to base and debriefed with his squadron intelligence officer, he mentioned the negative G dive. He said the engine had performed flawlessly. No hesitation, no power loss. The intelligence officer made a note in the combat report. Engine modification successful under extreme negative G conditions. Eric Locke was killed in action 2 weeks later on August 18, 1941. He was attacking German positions near Calais when his Spitfire was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He crashed in France. His body was never recovered. He was 21 years old. But during those final 2 weeks, Locke had scored 4 more kills. All of them involved negative G dives that he could only perform because his Spitfire's engine kept running. 4 more German aircraft destroyed, 4 fewer threats to Allied bombers and convoys, all because a 31-year-old female engineer had spent 20 minutes in a machine shop making a brass disc with a hole in the center. I want to pause here and talk about something that doesn't get mentioned enough when we discuss World War II. We talk about the battles, the campaigns, the generals and admirals. We talk about D-Day and the Battle of Midway and the Siege of Stalingrad. All of that matters. But wars are not won just by soldiers and generals. Wars are won by engineers and factory workers and scientists who solve problems that nobody else can solve. Beatrice Shilling never flew a combat mission. She never dropped a bomb or fired a gun. But her contribution to the Allied victory was as important as any fighter pilot's. She gave RAF pilots the ability to fight on equal terms with the Luftwaffe's best fighters. She saved lives. She changed the outcome of air battles, and she did it with a piece of metal that cost less than $1. If that doesn't earn your respect, I don't know what will. And if you respect that kind of quiet competence, that kind of unglamorous heroism, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who cares about history. These stories matter. These people matter. And the only way they stay alive is if we remember them and pass their stories on. Now, let me talk about the technical side of what Beatrice accomplished, because this is important for understanding why the orifice restrictor was such an elegant solution. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was a masterpiece of engineering. 12 cylinders arranged in a V configuration, liquid-cooled, supercharged. At maximum power, it produced about 1/200 horsepower in the early versions, more in later models. But all that power depended on precise fuel delivery. Too much fuel, and the engine would flood and quit. Too little fuel, and the engine would lean out and overheat or lose power. The SU carburetor regulated fuel delivery using a combination of the float chamber and a variable Venturi system. Under normal flight conditions, positive G forces or level flight, the system worked perfectly. Fuel flowed from the main tank into the float chamber. The float rose and fell, opening and closing the inlet valve. The carburetor mixed fuel and air in the correct ratio and fed it to the cylinders. But under negative G forces, gravity reversed. Fuel that should have been at the bottom of the float chamber surged to the top. The float, which was designed to rise when fuel levels increased, instead dropped because the fuel was above it. The inlet valve opened fully. Fuel flooded into the carburetor faster than the engine could burn it. The mixture became too rich. The engine drowned and stopped. Rolls-Royce had tried several solutions before Beatrice developed the orifice restrictor. They had tried redesigning the float chamber with baffles to prevent fuel from surging. Did not work well enough. They had tried using multiple smaller float chambers instead of one large chamber. Too complicated and added weight. They had tried developing a pressurized fuel system that would eliminate the float chamber entirely. That eventually worked, but it took years to develop and required significant modifications to the engine and airframe. Beatrice's approach was different. Instead of trying to prevent the fuel from surging, she limited how much fuel could enter the float chamber in the first place. The orifice restrictor acted as a bottleneck. Even if the float chamber valve was fully open, fuel could only flow through the restrictor at a controlled rate. That controlled rate was calculated to be exactly what the engine needed at maximum power. Under positive G conditions, During brief negative G maneuvers, fuel would still surge in the float chamber, but the restrictor prevented enough fuel from entering to cause flooding. The engine might run slightly rich for a second or two, but it would keep running. The genius of this solution was its simplicity. It required no modifications to the engine, no redesign of the carburetor, no new manufacturing processes. Just a brass disc installed in the existing fuel line. Any mechanic could install it in 90 seconds with a wrench, and because the restrictor was precisely calculated, it worked the first time. No prototypes, no iterations, no months of testing. Beatrice did the math, made the part, tested it, and it worked. That is what separates good engineers from great engineers. Good engineers can design complicated solutions to complicated problems. Great engineers can design simple solutions to complicated problems. Beatrice Shilling was a great engineer. But here is something else that made the orifice restrictor significant. It was designed by someone who understood both the theory and the practical constraints. Beatrice had spent 4 years testing Merlin engines. She knew their performance characteristics, their fuel consumption rates, their tolerances. She also knew what was practical in wartime. In March of 1941, Britain was fighting for survival. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities. U-boats were sinking convoys in the Atlantic. The RAF needed a solution to the carburetor flooding problem immediately, not in 6 months, not in a year. Beatrice gave them a solution that could be implemented in weeks. By mid-April of 1941, every operational Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had been modified. That kind of rapid deployment was only possible because the solution was simple. If Beatrice had designed a complex pressurized fuel system or a redesigned carburetor, it would have taken months to manufacture the parts and install them in every aircraft. Pilots would have continued dying while factories retooled and mechanics waited for parts. The orifice restrictor saved lives because it was simple enough to mass produce and install quickly. That was engineering driven by practicality, not elegance. The best solution was not the most sophisticated solution. The best solution was the one that worked right now, with the resources available right now. Beatrice understood that. She designed accordingly. And because she did, hundreds of RAF pilots survived 1941, who otherwise would have died. Let me tell you another story that illustrates the impact of the orifice restrictor. In June of 1941, the RAF launched Operation Circus, a series of offensive fighter sweeps over occupied France. The goal was to lure Luftwaffe fighters into combat and destroy them, to achieve air superiority over the Channel in preparation for eventual Allied landings in Europe. Operation Circus involved hundreds of sorties by Spitfires and Hurricanes. The flights crossed the Channel, penetrated French airspace, engaged German fighters, and returned to England. These missions were dangerous. German fighters operated from bases in France with short response times. They could intercept RAF formations quickly and in large numbers. During these missions, RAF pilots frequently found themselves in situations where they needed to dive aggressively to escape superior numbers or to pursue fleeing German fighters. Before the orifice restrictor, these dives were risky. Pilots had to choose between breaking off the attack and maintaining engine power, or committing to the dive and risking engine failure. After the orifice restrictor was installed, that choice disappeared. Pilots could dive as aggressively as necessary without worrying about engine failure. The psychological impact was significant. Fighter pilots need confidence in their aircraft. They need to know that when they push the stick forward or pull hard on a turn, the aircraft will respond. Uncertainty about engine reliability creates hesitation. Hesitation in combat gets you killed. The orifice restrictor eliminated that uncertainty. Pilots knew their engines would keep running no matter what maneuver they performed. That confidence translated into more aggressive tactics, more successful engagements, and fewer losses. Between June and September of 1941, RAF Fighter Command flew more than 20,000 sorties over France as part of Operation Circus and related missions. They engaged Luftwaffe fighters in hundreds of dogfights. They lost aircraft, they lost pilots, but they achieved their objective. They forced the Luftwaffe to commit fighters to defensive operations over France, fighters that could not be used on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. And throughout those 4 months, carburetor flooding was no longer a significant cause of RAF fighter losses. The orifice restrictor had eliminated the problem. Beatrice Shilling never flew on any of those missions. She never crossed the Channel or engaged a Bf-109 or risked her life over occupied France. But her work made those missions possible. Her engineering gave RAF pilots the tools they needed to fight and win. We're past the halfway point now, and I want to remind you why this story matters. We're living in a time when a lot of people think history is boring, that it's just dates and names and battles that happened a long time ago. But history isn't boring. History is people. Real people who faced real problems and found real solutions. Beatrice Shilling faced a problem that was killing British pilots. She found a solution that saved their lives. That's not boring. That's heroic. And if you think that's worth remembering, if you think people like Beatrice Shilling deserve to be recognized for what they did, hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what you think. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Because I'm going to keep telling these stories as long as people want to hear them. And every like, every comment, every subscription tells me that you want to hear them. Now, let me address something that some of you might be thinking. You might be wondering why Beatrice Shilling's name is not more famous, why she is not as well known as the fighter aces or the generals or the other famous figures from World War II. Part of the answer is that engineering work is invisible. When a Spitfire shoots down a Bf-109, people notice. The pilot gets a kill credit, maybe a medal, maybe a mention in the newspapers. When an engineer designs a modification that prevents the Spitfire from crashing, nobody notices. The aircraft does what it is supposed to do. That is the job. No drama, no headlines, no recognition. But there is more to it than that. Beatrice Shilling was a woman in a field dominated by men, working during an era when women's contributions to technical fields were systematically undervalued. After World War II, the British government published official histories of the war effort. These histories covered military operations, industrial production, scientific research, and technological development. Beatrice Shilling was mentioned in some of these histories, but usually in passing. A few sentences, maybe a paragraph. Her work was acknowledged, but not celebrated. Compare that to how male engineers were treated. Barnes Wallis, who designed the bouncing bomb used in the Dambusters raid, became famous. His story was turned into movies and books. He received a knighthood and numerous honors. Wallis deserved that recognition. His bouncing bomb was a brilliant piece of engineering that contributed to the Allied victory. But Beatrice Shilling's orifice restrictor also contributed to the Allied victory. It arguably saved more lives than the bouncing bomb. Yet Beatrice remained obscure for decades. The difference was not the quality of the engineering, the difference was gender. British society in the 1940s and 1950s was not comfortable celebrating women who had done traditionally male work. It was acceptable to acknowledge that women had contributed to the war effort. Women had worked in factories, driven ambulances, served in auxiliary military units. That was fine. But recognizing a woman as a brilliant engineer who had outperformed her male colleagues, that challenged too many assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. So Beatrice's story was quietly shelved. She received some recognition, enough to satisfy the historical record, but not enough to make her famous. That started to change in the 1990s and 2000s as historians began re-examining women's contributions to World War II. Beatrice Shilling's story was rediscovered and retold, but by then, Beatrice herself had been dead for years. She never lived to see herself recognized as one of the most important engineers of World War II. She never received the level of fame and recognition that her male counterparts enjoyed. That is a loss, not just for Beatrice, but for all of us. Because when we forget people like Beatrice Shilling, we lose part of our history. We lose examples of competence and ingenuity and quiet heroism that don't fit the traditional narratives. We lose role models for future generations of engineers, especially women who might look at Beatrice's story and think, if she could do it, maybe I can too. That is why I am telling this story now. That is why I spend hours researching these forgotten figures and making videos about them, because they deserve to be remembered, and because their stories have value that goes beyond just historical interest. These stories teach us about problem solving, about perseverance, about doing your job well, even when nobody is watching or applauding. Beatrice Shilling did not design the orifice restrictor to become famous. She designed it because British pilots were dying, and she had the skills to fix the problem. That is the kind of attitude we need more of today. Do your job, do it well, solve the problems in front of you, and don't worry about getting credit. Let me tell you one more technical detail about the orifice restrictor that I find fascinating. The restrictor was not a permanent solution, and Beatrice knew that when she designed it. It was a stopgap measure, a temporary fix that would work until a better solution could be developed, and Beatrice was involved in developing that better solution. While the orifice restrictors were being manufactured and installed in RAF fighters, Beatrice continued working on carburetor improvements at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She collaborated with engineers at Rolls-Royce to develop a pressurized carburetor system that would eliminate the float chamber problem entirely. That work took more than 2 years. The pressurized carburetor system required extensive testing, modifications to the engine design, new manufacturing processes. It was complicated, expensive, and time-consuming. Exactly the kind of solution that could not be implemented in March of 1941 when pilots were dying and the Battle of Britain was still being fought. But by 1943, the pressurized carburetor system was ready. It was incorporated into the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, which powered later versions of the Spitfire and the P-51 Mustang. The Merlin 61 could handle negative G-forces without any fuel delivery problems. No orifice restrictor needed. But here is the thing. The pressurized carburetor system could only be developed because the orifice restrictor had bought the RAF time. Between March of 1941 and late 1943, British pilots could fight effectively because their engines kept running during negative G maneuvers. That gave Rolls-Royce and the RAE 2.5 years to develop, test, and implement a permanent solution without the pressure of pilots dying every week from carburetor flooding. The orifice restrictor was a bridge. It connected the immediate crisis of 1941 with the long-term solution of 1943. That is good engineering strategy. Fix the urgent problem with whatever works right now, then take the time to develop the proper solution. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Get something that works into the field immediately, then iterate and improve. Beatrice understood that instinctively. She did not waste time trying to design the perfect carburetor in March of 1941. She designed something that would work well enough to save lives right now. Then she spent the next 2 years working on the perfect solution. Both contributions were important. Both saved lives. But the orifice restrictor is what she is remembered for because it was dramatic, immediate, and simple enough for people to understand. Let me tell you what happened to some of the pilots who benefited from Beatrice Shilling's work. We already talked about Eric Locke, who was killed in August of 1941. But many other pilots survived the war and went on to long careers. James Ginger Lacey, who I mentioned at the beginning of this story, survived the war with 28 confirmed kills. He remained in the RAF until 1967, retiring as a squadron leader. He died in 1989 at the age of 72. In interviews late in his life, Lacey credited the orifice restrictor with saving his life multiple times. He said that before the modification, he had been forced to break off attacks on German fighters at least a dozen times because he could not follow them through negative G dives. After the modification, he could pursue any German fighter through any maneuver. He called Beatrice Shilling the woman who gave us back our fighting edge. Another pilot who benefited from the orifice restrictor was Wing Commander Robert Stanford Tuck. Tuck was one of the RAF's top-scoring aces with 29 confirmed kills. He flew Hurricanes and Spitfires from 1940 through 1942. In January of 1942, Tuck was shot down over France and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war. But before his capture, Tuck had flown dozens of combat missions with the orifice restrictor installed in his aircraft. He later wrote that the modification had allowed him to engage German fighters with confidence, knowing that his engine would not fail during aggressive maneuvers. Then there was Pilot Officer Jeffrey Wellham, one of the youngest Spitfire pilots in Fighter Command. Wellham was only 18 years old when he joined No. 92 Squadron in August of 1940. He flew throughout the Battle of Britain and into 1941. Wellham later wrote a memoir called First Light that became one of the most acclaimed personal accounts of the Battle of Britain. In that memoir, Wellham described the frustration of breaking off attacks on Bf-109s because his engine would quit during negative G maneuvers. He wrote about the day in April of 1941 when ground crews installed the orifice restrictor in his Spitfire. He said it felt like someone had removed invisible chains from his aircraft. Suddenly, he could fight the way he had been trained to fight, aggressively, without worrying about engine failures. Wellham survived the war and lived until 2018, dying at the age of 96. He spent his final years giving talks about the Battle of Britain and the men and women who had made victory possible. He always mentioned Beatrice Shilling in those talks. He always made sure people knew that a female engineer had given RAF pilots the tools they needed to win. Squadron leader Douglas Bader was another pilot whose life was affected by the orifice restrictor. Bader was famous for continuing to fly combat missions despite having lost both legs in a pre-war flying accident. He flew with artificial legs and became one of the RAF's most successful fighter leaders. Bader was flying Hurricanes and later Spitfires during the period when the orifice restrictor was introduced. In his post-war writings, Bader noted that the modification had been a game-changer for RAF tactics. Before the restrictor, RAF fighters had been forced to avoid certain maneuvers that the Luftwaffe could perform safely. After the restrictor, RAF pilots could match the Bf-109 move for move. Bader was shot down and captured in August of 1941, but not before he had flown dozens of sorties with the modified engine. He credited the orifice restrictor with allowing him to score several of his 22 confirmed kills. The impact of Beatrice's work extended beyond individual pilots. It affected squadron-level tactics and strategy. Before the orifice restrictor, RAF squadron commanders had to train their pilots to avoid negative G maneuvers. They developed tactics that worked around the carburetor flooding problem. Defensive brakes, climbing turns, tactics that kept the aircraft in positive G conditions. These tactics worked, but they were limiting. They gave the Luftwaffe an advantage because German pilots knew that British fighters could not follow certain maneuvers. After the orifice restrictor was installed, squadron commanders could train their pilots in a full range of aerobatic maneuvers. They could teach aggressive diving attacks, rolling scissors, split S reversals, all the maneuvers that modern fighter combat required. The tactical flexibility this provided was enormous. RAF fighters were no longer predictable. German pilots could no longer rely on negative G dives to escape. The playing field was level. Fighter Command headquarters recognized this change. In June of 1941, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commander of No. 12 Group, issued a directive to all squadron commanders under his command. The directive noted that the recent engine modifications had eliminated previous restrictions on negative G maneuvers. Pilots were now authorized to engage enemy fighters using any tactically appropriate maneuver, regardless of G forces involved. The directive specifically mentioned that the modification had been developed by Royal Aircraft Establishment engineers and had proven completely reliable in combat conditions. Lee Mallory did not mention Beatrice Shilling by name, but he was referring to her work. That directive represented a fundamental change in how Fighter Command approached air combat. For the first time since the war began, RAF fighters had complete freedom of maneuver. They were no longer fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The Luftwaffe noticed the change and struggled to adapt. German intelligence reports from the summer of 1941 show confusion about what the British had done to solve the carburetor problem. Some reports speculated that the RAF had equipped all Spitfires and Hurricanes with fuel injection systems. Other reports suggested that the British had developed a new type of carburetor that worked differently than standard float chamber designs. A few reports came close to the truth, mentioning that British fighters seemed to have some kind of fuel flow restriction that prevented flooding, but the Germans never fully understood what the British had done. They never learned that the solution was as simple as a brass disc with a hole drilled in it. If they had known how simple the fix was, they might have been embarrassed. The Luftwaffe had some of the best aircraft engineers in the world. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Heinkel. These companies employed thousands of talented designers and engineers, yet none of them had thought to solve the Merlin's carburetor problem the way Beatrice Shilling had solved it. They had assumed the solution would require sophisticated engineering, redesigned systems, complex modifications. They had never considered that a simple restrictor could work. That reveals something important about engineering culture and assumptions. Sometimes the best solutions are simple, but we overlook them because we assume complex problems require complex solutions. Beatrice did not make that assumption. She looked at the problem, identified the root cause, and designed the simplest intervention that would address that cause. She did not over-engineer. She did not try to impress anyone with sophisticated designs. She just solved the problem. These pilots, and hundreds of others like them, owed their lives to Beatrice Shilling's 50-cent washer. They flew their missions, fought their battles, and returned home to their families because a female engineer had spent 20 minutes in a machine shop solving a problem that had stumped everyone else. That is legacy. That is impact. And that is why Beatrice Shilling's story deserves to be told. We're coming to the end here, and I want to leave you with something to think about. Beatrice Shilling was not a pilot. She was not a soldier. She never fired a shot in anger or dropped a bomb on an enemy target. But she contributed to the Allied victory in World War II as much as any fighter ace or bomber crew. She solved a problem that was killing British pilots. She did it quickly, efficiently, and with elegance. And she did it without seeking recognition or fame. She just did her job. That is the kind of person who wins wars. Not just the soldiers and pilots, but the engineers and scientists and factory workers who give the soldiers and pilots the tools they need to succeed. We need to remember these people. We need to tell their stories. We need to recognize that heroism comes in many forms, and sometimes the most important heroism is the quiet kind. The kind that happens in a machine shop or a laboratory or a test facility. The kind that never makes the headlines but saves lives anyway. Let me tell you something about the broader context of Beatrice's achievement. In 1941, Britain was fighting alone against Nazi Germany. The United States had not yet entered the war. The Soviet Union had just been invaded and was reeling from German attacks. France had fallen. The British Empire stood as the last major power opposing Hitler in Europe, and Britain's survival depended on the Royal Air Force. If the RAF lost control of the skies over Britain, German bombers would destroy British cities and industrial centers. German invasion barges would cross the Channel unopposed. The war would be over. So every advantage the RAF could gain, every technical improvement, every tactical edge, mattered enormously. The orifice restrictor was one of those advantages. It was not as dramatic as radar or as visible as the Spitfire's elliptical wings, but it was just as important. It kept RAF fighters competitive with the Luftwaffe's best aircraft. It kept pilots alive. It kept Britain in the war. And here is something else to consider. Beatrice Shilling developed the orifice restrictor in early 1941, months before the United States entered the war. When America did enter the war in December of 1941, the RAF's experience with the Merlin engine and the orifice restrictor became valuable intelligence for American aircraft designers. The United States was building its own fighters powered by American engines, but many of those engines used similar carburetor designs and faced similar problems under negative G conditions. American engineers studied the British solution and adapted it for American aircraft. The P-40 Warhawk, which used an Allison V1710 engine, had a float chamber carburetor similar to the Merlin's. American pilots flying P-40s in North Africa and the Pacific encountered the same carburetor flooding problems that RAF pilots had faced. The solution was the same, an orifice restrictor installed in the fuel line. The Americans called it a fuel flow restrictor, or sometimes an anti-G baffle, but it was the same basic design that Beatrice had developed: simple, effective, cheap to produce, easy to install. Thousands of American pilots benefited from Beatrice Shilling's work without ever knowing her name. They flew their P-40s and later their P-51 Mustangs, which also used Merlin engines built under license by Packard, and they could dive and roll and fight aggressively because a British engineer had solved the carburetor flooding problem 3 years earlier. That is how engineering knowledge spreads during wartime. Solutions developed by one country's engineers get shared with allies, adapted, improved, and deployed across multiple platforms and theaters. Beatrice's orifice restrictor became part of the Allied technical advantage in World War II. It helped level the playing field between Allied fighters and Axis fighters. It saved lives on multiple continents, in multiple air forces, in multiple campaigns. And Beatrice never sought credit for any of it. She continued her work at the Royal Aircraft Establishment throughout the war, solving other problems, testing other engines, contributing to other projects. The orifice restrictor was just one item on a long list of accomplishments. After the war, when historians started writing about British technical achievements during World War II, they focused on the big, dramatic projects: radar development, code breaking at Bletchley Park, the bouncing bomb, jet engine development. These were important achievements and they deserved recognition, but they overshadowed smaller achievements like the orifice restrictor, smaller in scale perhaps, but not smaller in impact. Beatrice's brass washer saved more lives than many of the celebrated technical achievements of the war. It just did not look impressive in photographs or make for exciting stories in newspapers. That is the nature of engineering. The best engineering is often invisible. It works so well that people forget it exists. They take it for granted. Aircraft engines are supposed to keep running during dives. Nobody thinks about why they keep running or what modifications were necessary to make them reliable. They just expect it to work. And when it does work, the engineer who made it work gets forgotten. Beatrice Shilling understood this. She did not seem bothered by the lack of recognition. She had solved the problem. That was enough. She had given RAF pilots the tools they needed to survive and win. The fact that most people would never know her name did not diminish the value of what she had accomplished. In her later years, after she retired from the Royal Aircraft establishment, Beatrice occasionally gave talks to engineering societies and universities. She spoke about her career, her work on aircraft engines, the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field. When people asked about the orifice restrictor, she would smile and say it was the simplest thing she had ever designed, just a piece of brass with a hole in it. Nothing special, but then she would add that simple solutions are often the best solutions. Complex engineering is impressive, but it is not always effective. Sometimes the best thing an engineer can do is identify the simplest intervention that will solve the problem and implement it as quickly as possible. That was her philosophy. That was how she approached every problem she worked on. Find the simplest solution that works. Implement it fast. Move on to the next problem. That philosophy served Britain well during World War II. It serves engineers well today. In an era of increasingly complex technology, we sometimes forget that simplicity has value. We assume that sophisticated problems require sophisticated solutions. We over-engineer. We add features and complexity because we can, not because we should. Beatrice Shilling reminds us that the best engineering is often the simplest engineering. The solution that works with the fewest parts, the least complexity, the fastest implementation time. That is what wins wars. That is what saves lives. A brass washer, a hole drilled in the center, 90 seconds to install. That is brilliant engineering. Beatrice Shilling was a hero. She deserves to be remembered alongside the fighter aces and the generals and the other famous figures from World War II. If you agree, if you think her story matters, do me one last favor. Hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who loves history. Because the only way these stories survive is if we tell them. The only way these people are remembered is if we remember them. And that is on us. That is our responsibility. So let's make sure Beatrice Shilling is not forgotten. Let's make sure her story gets told, and let's make sure that future generations know that a 31-year-old female engineer with a piece of brass and a drill press changed the course of the air war over Europe. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about this history. And thank you for helping make sure these stories don't disappear into silence.